He's just an obsessed fan," Sienna said, her voice smooth and untroubled on live television. I stared at the screen, my knuckles white, watching the woman who wore my engagement ring look directly at the cameras and erase 3 years of my life. Behind her, the host held up a blurry paparazzi photograph of me leaving her luxury penthouse at dawn. They were calling me a dangerous stalker, and my fiancée was nodding along, smiling for the millions of viewers to protect her spotless brand. I held my breath in my dark apartment, the cold blue light of the TV screen reflecting off the blank walls. We had rehearsed her coming out announcement 1,000 times, preparing for the moment she would finally tell the world that I was her fiancé. Instead, she laughed, a light, dismissive sound that echoed through the empty room like a gunshot, leaving me to face a global wave of internet hate alone. My phone buzzed continuously on the kitchen counter, filled with frantic messages from friends who knew the truth, but I stood completely frozen, staring at the screen. Sienna Carter, the nation's biggest superstar, was throwing me to the wolves with the flawless grace that had won her an Oscar. Behind her, the studio audience chuckled at her charm, and the host made a mocking joke about obsessive admirers, cementing my new identity as the nation's most hated creep. The echo of her fake laughter lingered in the quiet corners of my apartment as the darkness swallowed me whole. For 3 long years, I had lived in the quiet shadows, happily accepting the role of the invisible partner because I believed her promises that the secrecy was just temporary, a necessary sacrifice for her skyrocketing career that would end the moment her contract was renewed. We met during her first small theater production, before the agents discovered her, when she was just a passionate actress looking for someone to share her dreams with over cheap coffee in plastic cups. When her career began to gain momentum, she looked at me with tears in her eyes, asking me to be patient, promising that once she secured her first major film role, she would tell the world about us. I agreed without hesitation, because I loved her, and because I believed that a relationship was defined by the quiet moments of support rather than the public validation of a red carpet. Our engagement was a quiet affair, occurring on a rainy night in a small, empty restaurant we had rented out, where I slipped the diamond ring onto her finger, and she swore that she would marry me the moment her current contract expired. Sienna constantly reassured me that once the next movie was released, once the next award season ended, or once the next major contract was finalized, we would finally announce our relationship to the public. I never pressured her, never demanded that she choose between her career and our love, because I believed that patience was the ultimate proof of devotion. I watched her travel to exotic locations for film shoots, sending me quiet texts of sunset views, while I remained in our apartment, waiting for the brief windows of time when she could return to being just Sienna. The contract was always extended, the next movie was always more important than the last, and the reasons for keeping me hidden became increasingly complex and urgent. I began to feel like a secret that had to be kept, a liability that could damage her carefully constructed image of the glamorous, single starlet that millions of fans adored. Victor, her calculating manager, was the only one in her professional circle who knew about us. He made his disapproval clear from the very beginning, reminding Sienna that a public relationship would destroy her marketability. I ignored his warnings, believing that Sienna's love for me was stronger than the superficial demands of her industry. But Victor was persistent, his cold voice always whispering in her ear, warning her that every public appearance with me was a step toward career suicide. We had plan after plan, discussing the wedding ceremony we would have in a small coastal town, the quiet life we would lead once the contracts expired, and the relief of finally walking down the street together without fear of the cameras. I lived for those promises, using them as a shield against the growing loneliness that threatened to consume me during her long absences. But the industry had other plans, and when the studio cast her alongside Sebastian Vance, the country's most desirable leading man, the publicity machine went into overdrive, fabricating a high-profile romance that the media devoured. The dating rumors spread like wildfire, and social media quickly became obsessed with them as the perfect Hollywood couple, leaving me to watch their fabricated romance unfold on my screen. I wasn't jealous of the actor himself, because I knew the industry was built on illusion, but I was devastated by the fact that the entire world was celebrating another man standing beside the woman I planned to marry. She swore it was all business, a standard marketing tactic to drive ticket sales, and she cried in my arms when she came home, begging me to hold her because the fake relationship was draining her soul. So I swallowed my pride, hid our engagement ring in my drawer whenever Victor came to visit, and spent my weekends alone in my apartment while she flew to private islands for promotional shoots with Sebastian. The media's obsession with Sienna and Sebastian reached a fever pitch, with talk shows and entertainment magazines speculating on their wedding plans, while I sat in our kitchen, making coffee for one. The fake relationship became a wall between us, and even when she was home, she was constantly checking her phone, monitoring the public reaction to her fabricated romance. I began to realize that the line between her real life and her public persona was blurring, and that the girl who used to eat cheap cereal on my couch was slowly being replaced by the character she played for the public. Victor visited our apartment one evening, his face grim as he laid out the latest marketing reports on the coffee table. The public's obsession with Sienna and Sebastian is driving her career to unprecedented heights, he said, his thin lips curling into a cold smile. A real boyfriend, especially an ordinary architect, would ruin the campaign. Keep your distance. Or you will destroy her success. I felt a cold dread settle in my chest as I realized that the man who was supposed to be her partner was being viewed as a threat to her success, a secret that had to be buried deeper. She came to me later, her voice soft and apologetic, explaining that Victor was only doing his job and that the movie's success was crucial for her future contract negotiations. I nodded, because that was what I always did, but the weight of the sacrifice was becoming heavier than I could bear, and the silence in the apartment felt more oppressive than ever. Then came the morning when the cameras caught me, a split-second mistake when I stepped out of her back exit to head to my architecture firm, my face captured in high definition by a photographer hiding behind a parked delivery truck. My inbox flooded with threats from her obsessive fanbase, demanding that I leave their queen alone, while my boss quietly called me into his office to explain that my presence was becoming a liability to the firm. I stood in his office, looking at the street below, realizing that the quiet life I had built was collapsing around me because of a single, accidental photograph. My parents called me that afternoon, their voices filled with concern as they explained that strange cars had been parking outside their house and that strangers were calling their home phone, asking questions about my past. The consequences of remaining a secret had finally become painfully real, affecting the people I loved most, and I felt a deep, burning anger at my own helplessness. I called Sienna, who was in the middle of a press junket, her voice frantic as she told me that Victor was handling the situation and that I needed to stay indoors and avoid talking to the media. I spent the next 24 hours pacing my apartment, watching the news anchors dissect my photograph, calling me a dangerous predator, an obsessive fan who was trying to exploit Sienna's fame for personal gain. I kept telling myself that tonight would be the night she finally chose me over her career, the night she would tell the world the truth and end this nightmare. When the live broadcast began, my heart was hammering against my ribs, and I stared at her beautiful face, waiting for the truth to set us both free, only to watch her throw me to the wolves to protect her spotless reputation. She told the world that I was a stalker, a delusional fan who had misunderstood her kindness, validating every insult and accusation that had been circulating online for the past day. I stood up, walked to my bedroom, and looked at the diamond ring sitting in the small velvet box inside my drawer, realizing it was just a piece of metal, a symbol of a future that had never actually existed outside of my own hopeful imagination. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, the darkness of the room matching the cold clarity that was slowly settling over my mind, realizing that the relationship had always been a one-way street where I was the only one paying the toll. An hour later, the sound of a key turning in my lock broke the silence. Sienna stepped into the apartment, wearing a large black coat and a baseball cap to hide her face. Her eyes scanned the room nervously as she shut the door. "Victor threatened to ruin my contract if I admitted to the engagement," she cried. "I had no choice, Adrian. I had to do it." I stepped back, avoiding her touch. "Adrian, please. You have to understand the pressure I was under," she pleaded, her blue eyes filling with tears. "It was live television. They cornered me. If I had told the truth, the movie would have tanked," she continued, her voice trembling. "My career would be over. Everything we worked for would be gone." I really looked at her, and realized that the woman standing before me was no longer the girl I fell in love with. She was a product, a brand that was willing to crush me to protect its market value. "I don't care about the movie, Sienna," I said, my voice shockingly calm, devoid of the anger she was clearly expecting. "I never cared about the red carpets, the awards, or the millions of fans. I just wanted to stop being the person you sacrifice whenever your career gets slightly uncomfortable. But you made your choice, and you chose your brand." She looked at me, her jaw tightening as her panic began to morph into frustration, reminding me of how much she had sacrificed to get to this point and how I was supposed to be her support system. "You're being incredibly selfish right now," she whispered, her voice dropping into a cold, defensive tone. "I did what I had to do to protect our future, and now you're throwing a tantrum because your ego is bruised. You'll cool down, you always do, and we'll figure out a way to get past this once the media cycle moves on." She reached out and patted my shoulder, a gesture that felt patronizingly familiar, before turning around and walking out the door, confident that a few days of silence would bring me back to my knees. But as the door clicked shut, something shifted inside me, a sudden, crystalline clarity that washed away the lingering doubt and replaced it with a quiet, immovable resolve. I realized that she was right about one thing: I had always cooled down, I had always forgiven her, and that was exactly why she felt so comfortable destroying my life on national television. I didn't feel anger or a desire for revenge, I simply felt a profound, peaceful certainty that the relationship was over, and that the only way to save myself was to walk away from the shadow she had cast over my life. The next morning, I woke up early, the sun rising over the city streets, casting long shadows across my bedroom as I packed my life into cardboard boxes, determined to disappear before she realized I was gone. Then, I drafted my resignation letter to the architecture firm, expressing my gratitude but stating that personal circumstances required my immediate relocation, a move that my boss accepted with a visible sigh of relief. For the next 5 days, I worked with a quiet, robotic efficiency, selling my furniture online, donating my clothes, and packing only the essentials into 2 large suitcases that would accompany me on my journey. He was thrilled to hear from me, and within 48 hours, the contract was signed, the visa was sponsored, and my flight was booked for the following Tuesday morning, giving me just enough time to erase the remaining traces of my existence. I felt a strange sense of excitement, a feeling of possibility that had been absent from my life for 3 long years. My parents were the only people I told, sitting in their cozy kitchen as my mother quietly cried, holding my hand while my father stared out the window with a grim, understanding silence. "You spent 3 years protecting someone who never stood up for you, Adrian," my mother whispered, her voice trembling but her eyes filled with a fierce, protective pride. "It's time you started protecting yourself, even if it means leaving us for a little while." I hugged them tightly, feeling the warmth of their unconditional love, a stark contrast to the transactional nature of the relationship I was leaving behind. On my final night in the city, I walked through the quiet streets, the cool night air refreshing after days of confinement, looking at the towering billboards displaying Sienna's face, realizing she was everywhere, yet completely gone from my life. I took my phone out of my pocket, went to the settings, and systematically deleted every social media account I owned, watching the profiles that had been harassed by her fans disappear into digital nothingness. I wanted no trace of my past left online, no way for her or her fans to track my progress or intrude on the new life I was building. Finally, I removed the SIM card from my phone, snapped it in half, and tossed it into a nearby trash can, cutting the final thread that connected me to the world I was leaving behind. I bought a cheap, prepaid burner phone for my parents to reach me, ensuring that no one else would have access to my new number. I boarded the plane the next morning, the engines roaring to life as the city shrank below me, a patchwork of concrete and glass that had held me prisoner for 3 years, now fading into the clouds. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, rebuilding my career and my heart in a strange city where I knew almost no one, but for the first time in a long time, the future belonged entirely to me. Meanwhile, Sienna was fully immersed in her promotional tour, basking in the glowing reviews of her movie, convinced that her public denial had successfully saved her career and that I was quietly waiting for her call. She focused on her interviews, smiling for the cameras and playing along with the dating rumors with Sebastian, convinced that she was handling the situation perfectly and that our relationship would resume once the publicity tour ended. She had no idea that the apartment she had visited was already empty, and that the man she believed would always forgive her had already crossed the Atlantic. It wasn't until 8 days after the interview, sitting in her luxury hotel suite in another city on her tour, that she finally decided to dial my number, expecting me to answer on the first ring as I always did. The computerized voice stating that the number was no longer in service sent a sudden, cold jolt of panic through her chest, prompting her to dial again, thinking she had made a mistake. She stared at the screen, her heart starting to race as she tried calling through various messaging apps, only to find that my profiles had vanished, replaced by generic error screens. She immediately called Victor, demanding to know if he had done something to my phone, but her manager was equally confused, insisting he hadn't touched my personal accounts and warning her not to do anything rash. Sienna refused to listen, her voice rising in panic as she realized that she had no way of contacting the man who had been her anchor for 3 years. Ignoring his warnings, Sienna booked a private jet back to the city that very night, her mind racing with 100 different scenarios, convinced that I was just playing a game to get back at her for the interview. She arrived at my apartment building at midnight, pulling her hood low as she hurried past the front desk, rushing up the stairs to my door and pounding on the wood with a desperate, frantic energy. The hallway was quiet, the sound of her knocks echoing off the walls, but there was no response from inside, only the silence of an empty home. The door was opened not by me, but by a middle-aged man in a white undershirt who looked at her with sleepy, annoyed eyes, explaining that he had rented the apartment 3 days ago and had never heard of an Adrian. She ran to her car, her hands shaking as she drove to my office building, waiting in the parking lot until morning, desperate to catch me before I walked through the front doors. She sat in the driver's seat, watching the employees arrive, her eyes scanning every face, hoping to see the messy charcoal black hair and the quiet posture she knew so well. When she finally sneaked into the lobby and asked the receptionist for me, she was directed to the HR department, where a polite woman informed her that I had resigned a week ago and left no forwarding address. The reality of my disappearance began to settle over her like a suffocating blanket, a terrifying realization that she had pushed me too far, and that the man who had always been there was suddenly gone. She spent the next 2 days calling our mutual friends, pleading for information, but the responses she received were cold and dismissive, filled with a quiet anger she had never expected from people who used to flatter her. They had watched her deny me on live television, and their loyalty lay with the friend who had been wronged, not the celebrity who had wronged him. "He gave you everything, Sienna," one of our old college friends told her before hanging up. "And you called him a stalker on national television. Why would any of us tell you where he is?" Desperate and running out of options, Sienna drove to my parents' house in the suburbs, the quiet, tree-lined street reminding her of the holidays we had spent together, back when things were simple and honest. She parked her luxury car at the curb, feeling out of place in the quiet neighborhood, and walked up the front steps with a heart heavy with dread. My mother opened the door, her face hardening when she saw Sienna standing on the porch, but she didn't shout or slam the door, instead stepping back to let her into the living room. My mother looked down at her with a sad, pitying expression, her voice quiet but steady as she spoke the words that would haunt Sienna for the rest of her life. "Adrian spent 3 years protecting you, Sienna, hiding in the dark so you could shine, and the first time he needed you to protect him, you destroyed him to save yourself. We love you, or at least we loved the girl you used to be, but for the first time in our son's life, we are going to respect his decision, and we will never tell you where he went." Sienna left their house in a daze, the quiet suburban streets offering no comfort as she realized that she was completely alone, stripped of the support system that had kept her grounded. She drove back to her massive, empty mansion, the luxury she had fought so hard to achieve now feeling like a cold, hollow monument to her own selfishness. The months that followed were a slow, agonizing torture for Sienna, as the excitement of her movie's success faded, leaving behind a hollow, empty void that no amount of fame or public admiration could fill. She went through the motions of her career, attending award ceremonies and signing new contracts, but the thrill was gone, replaced by a constant, aching regret. Everywhere she went, she was reminded of my absence, realizing that the quiet, invisible support I had provided was the only thing that had kept her sane in a world of superficial relationships. She began to notice the small details of her daily life that I had quietly handled, from the organized schedules to the quiet words of encouragement she had taken for granted. She spent her nights in her empty mansion, reading through our old text messages, weeping over the simple, loving words we had exchanged before the fame consumed her, realizing how cheap her success felt without me there to share it. She looked at the diamond ring she had hidden away, a silent reminder of the promise she had broken to protect her career. Her co-star Sebastian attempted to pursue a real relationship with her, encouraged by the studio and the media who wanted to capitalize on their popularity, but she found his polished charm repulsive, a stark contrast to my quiet, genuine honesty. She realized that Sebastian was just like her, a brand, a collection of public relations strategies with no real substance underneath. During interviews, she struggled to maintain her smiling persona, her eyes constantly scanning the crowds, hoping to catch a glimpse of the messy charcoal black hair and the deep brown eyes of the man she had thrown away. She would freeze for a second when a question about her personal life was asked, the memory of her own denial catching in her throat like glass. I was thousands of miles away, building a new life in the new city, working at a prestigious architecture firm where my skills were valued and my personal life was respected. I worked long hours, throwing myself into my designs, creating spaces that were open, honest, and filled with natural light, a reflection of the clarity I had found after leaving Sienna. My colleagues were friendly and professional, and I slowly began to form new friendships, rebuilding the social circle that had been destroyed by the media storm. Eliza, a talented designer at the firm, became a close friend, her quick wit and warm laugh helping me feel welcome in the unfamiliar city. We would spend hours discussing architecture over coffee, or walking through the city's parks after work, our relationship built on mutual respect and shared interests, free of the secrets and lies that had defined my past. I never spoke about Sienna, and no one at the firm knew about the paparazzi photograph or the scandal that had forced me to leave the city. I was just Adrian, a talented architect from my home country, and the piece of that simple identity was the greatest gift I had ever received. I still thought of Sienna sometimes, but the memory was no longer accompanied by pain or longing, only by a quiet, distant sadness for the girl she had once been and the choices she had made. I had forgiven her, not because she deserved it, but because carrying the anger was a burden I no longer wanted to bear in my new life. Meanwhile, Sienna's career began to suffer as her unhappiness became increasingly visible to the public, her performances losing the spark that had made her a star. The media began to comment on her tired appearance and her distant behavior, speculating on the cause of her sudden change, unaware of the quiet architect she was mourning. Victor tried to intervene, urging her to focus on her work and play along with the romance with Sebastian, but she refused, her frustration with the industry and her manager reaching a boiling point. She realized that the people who claimed to protect her were only interested in the revenue she generated, and that the only person who had loved her unconditionally was gone. She began to visit the places we had shared in the city, sitting in the quiet coffee shops and walking through the parks where we had once been happy, hoping to feel some connection to the life she had lost. The locations were the same, but the magic had vanished, leaving behind only the cold, empty shells of memories that she couldn't recreate. She wrote letters to me, pages of apologies and pleas for forgiveness, but she had no address to send them to, and they remained locked in her desk drawer, a secret testament to her regret. She knew that she had made her choice, and that the consequences of that choice were hers alone to bear in the quiet luxury of her mansion. 6 months after I left, Victor accidentally discovered my location through a business contact who had partnered with the new city architecture firm, immediately bringing the information to Sienna to stop her downward spiral. He thought that finding me would help her recover her focus, unaware that the resolution of our story would not be the reunion she was hoping for. Within 24 hours, Sienna had booked a flight to the new city, abandoning her filming schedule and ignoring the warnings of her agents, driven by a desperate, obsessive need to see me one last time. She tracked me down to a quiet, brick-paved street near my new office, waiting in a small coffee shop across the road, her heart pounding as she watched the door of the building. She sat near the window, her face hidden behind sunglasses and a scarf, her hands shaking as she clutched a cup of cold tea, waiting for the clock to strike 5. At 5 o'clock, the doors opened, and I walked out into the cool air of the new city air, wearing a dark coat, my hair messy as always, but my face looking relaxed, free of the tension that had defined my final year in the city. She stepped out of the coffee shop, calling my name, her voice trembling as I turned to look at her, my expression shifting from surprise to a quiet, calm neutrality that was more devastating than any anger. I looked at her, the woman who had once been my entire world, and realized that she no longer held any power over my heart. We walked to a quiet park nearby, the autumn leaves falling around us as we stood near a stone bridge, the silence between us heavy with the weight of 3 years of love and 6 months of absolute silence. She promised to announce our engagement the very next day, to face the media, to walk away from her career if that was what it took to prove her love. I listened to her, my expression unchanged, realizing that the desperation in her voice was no longer about loving me, but about her inability to accept that she had finally lost something she couldn't buy back. "I'm not angry anymore, Sienna," I said quietly, my voice carrying no malice, just a simple, devastating honesty that made her flinch. "But I'm not coming back either. I spent 3 years waiting for you to choose me, and when you finally had the chance, you chose your career, and in doing so, you taught me how to live without you. I like the man I am here, and I like the quiet life I've built, a life where I don't have to hide in the shadows of someone else's spotlight." She cried, begging me to remember the love we shared, but I gently reached out, untangling her hand from my sleeve, and turned to walk away into the falling leaves, leaving her alone on the bridge. Sienna watched me go, her tears blurring the silhouette of the only man who had ever loved her for who she was, not what she was, finally realizing that some people don't leave in anger. They simply learn their worth, and when they walk away forever, leaving behind a silence that no amount of applause will ever be able to drown out. I walked back to the street where Eliza was waiting, the cool rain beginning to fall, feeling the weight of the past finally lift from my shoulders as we walked together into the city. I didn't look back, knowing that the story of the famous girlfriend was finally over, and that my own story was just beginning in the quiet, honest spaces of my new life.